talk about boundaries, a lot of people have problems with boundaries. Number one, most people were not taught about boundaries. I know I was not. My family of origin did not teach me specifically about boundaries. There may have been some that existed, but they did not teach me specifically about, hey, this is a boundary. You're going to have boundaries in life. This is what they represent. This is how you create them. This is how you communicate them. And when they're violated, this is what you do. We have all gone through, from K to 12 or even beyond. And, what course did you really have, or what class did you have where you specifically were taught boundaries? Most likely you did not have it. So our family of origin, and then of course, our education platforms that exist largely did not teach us about boundaries. And then the other component is you really don't learn about boundaries in society. You learn about hurt, you learn about pain, you learn about walls, but you don't learn about boundaries. So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. And, queue up your questions. We'll get to where we can have some pretty good dialogue there in reference to questions. Let me turn on my side the chat here so I can see when things pop up that we can go from there. So, when you talk about being controlled or being in a controlling relationship, again, whether that's from your family of origin, your mom, your dad, your brother or sister, someone who is, okay. You got a question, Dixie?
Yes. I know you're just getting started.
Okay. I thought you were giving me a high five or something.
Okay. My question is that do you think that the reason why we don't establish boundaries and we don't communicate our boundaries is because of the world being in such a place of conformity?
That's a good point. That's really
okay. That do you think?
Yeah, no, that I like that. I'm glad you brought that out. I think that definitely that has a big part to do with it, is that there's this mindset, and I think, more modern times, of course, but it's certainly been there because we know it's demonic, but that mindset that, yeah, we need to conform, and, conformity or compliance to things doesn't necessarily mean that we're changing. It just means that we're doing what people tell us to do. And if there's that pressure, and today we could call it societal pressure. I mean, you could be called out real fast if you don't comply to certain things. And that's where our freedoms are being taken away from, in part, is that, no, you need to do this. This is what you need to do. This, it doesn't matter what your boundary is. We'll blow right through it, whether it's various areas of society or government or what have you. So that's a very good point. And I think we can draw a lot from that. And I think we will as we go through this lesson today. So thanks for bringing that up. So when you think in terms of any type of control, frankly, had boundaries been established and communicated in whatever that relationship is or whoever it's with, then most likely you would either not have stayed in that position of control, or you would have, even if you stayed in it, there would have been consequences deployed towards the controlling person or party that said, no, this is not going to happen. So again, we need to really dig into this to understand some things. So what is a boundary? Let's start with that. What is a boundary? And maybe we can not just say what a boundary is, but let's talk what a boundary is not. And I talk a lot about this when I'm coaching, or we're coaching married couples or individuals. It doesn't matter. But a boundary is not a wall. It's not a wall that you put up to where you've isolated yourself from people, you've isolated yourself from the world, you've isolated yourself where you're just kind of walled up. And I understand that people do create walls, both males and females alike, that they create walls, but that is not a healthy boundary. Most of the time when we establish walls in our life, we're establishing walls because we've been hurt emotionally, maybe physically or mentally or whatever it may be. And when we've experienced hurt is, it's painful, and we don't want that any longer. So we put up walls as a defense mechanism to try to, keep things away from us or keep people out. The problem is that when we put up walls in our life, they actually become self-sabotaging, because we don't give ourselves the liberty, the freedom, the right, as it were, to love people, or to have genuine, good, healthy people to love us. We have these walls, and we stay kind of clammed up or shelled up within that wall, and that's not healthy. Okay. So you want to make certain that you understand that a boundary is not a wall. A boundary is a dividing line. A boundary is a boundary line that creates space. A boundary line is something that reflects that, hey, this is where your life starts and your life ends and my life starts. Okay. So, and we need to have boundaries. I know a lot of believers have problems with it. They have problems with boundaries, and not so much the boundaries. They have a lot of problem when the boundaries are violated. What do? They have a difficult time. First and foremost, of course, saying no. But then the second thing is, okay, so I said no, but the person blew right through the boundary. Now what do I do? And they're so confused because of religious teaching that they think, well, like Dixie just said, well, I just need to comply. I just need to conform. I just need to do. It doesn't matter what I think. Okay, I need to love you, and therefore we equate love to I accept what you're doing, and that's not love. Love is not where we just allow people or institutions, organizations, what have you, to just enter our life indiscriminately, like they have access right to our life. That is not good. When we don't have boundaries, typically people that do not have boundaries are viewed as limitless, as weak, as unstable, and people or principalities, demons that are controlling. Okay, and we, like Dixie said, very good point she made. We live in a controlling society. Okay. And if we don't have any boundaries, we're considered weak. We're considered unstable. We're all over the place. That's unhealthy. And we don't have limits. And when you don't have limits, the enemy within people will come in and take advantage of that. Okay. Not having boundaries basically gives people permission to manipulate you. They can do whatever they want to you because you don't have boundaries. So just exactly what is a boundary? Again, a boundary is a dividing line. I think it could be looked at as a fence or a property line. It's a dividing space. For example, if you have a home or you live in some type of apartment, you may have a fence around your home. You probably have a door on the front of your home and perhaps the back. Okay, if you have a back door, however all that works, but let's just talk about the front door. You have a door there. Well, a fence is a type of boundary. It's letting people know that, okay, you're good over there. That's access space for you. But once you come over this fence or through that fence, now you're on my property, and I have unique rights to that property. And again, thinking more in terms of, not a house, but your own life. My life, I have rights, and I'm just not going to let people, again, demons get in people, and you have to have boundaries with people. I'll never forget, I was a guest speaker at a pretty large conference, and I was sitting next to someone, and I said something. I can't recall what it was, but specifically, but it was in line with boundaries, and it was more in line with the consequence of a boundary. And I said, well, you have to terminate that relationship, or you have to cut that relationship. And the preacher triggered. He manifests. He said, we can't do that. See, that's the problem we have today, is that we're telling people to cut relationships. Well, wait a minute. In the body of Christ, yes, we are to be joined together. We are to be unified. That's without question. But boundaries are all in the Bible. And just because you're a believer doesn't mean that I need to accept your behavior, specifically if your behavior is looking to cross that fence. So you may have an ideology. I talk to people all the time about this, and people have problems with it, real problems, that your ideology may be this, but if it crosses the boundary of my ideology or my fence, I don't have to accept. And I take issue with someone forcing me to accept a particular view about a particular topic. That's called control. Again, it's not initially a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of I have the right to have a boundary. We can deal with, working things out down the road. But if we don't have boundaries, we're going to be all over the place. And again, we're telling people that, hey, you could just come into my life anyway, and that you want. So these boundaries are dividing lines. Boundaries are, go over to Titus, or you just take note of it. Titus chapter 2, verse number 12, and I'll read it. I'll read it out of the English Standard Version, which I kind of like. Amplified says something very similar. But in Titus chapter 2, verse number 12, watch this now. It says, training us. Actually, let's pick it up in verse 11 to kind of give some context here. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation or deliverance to all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. So boundaries are really, when you look at it from your perspective, your kingdom or Christian perspective, boundaries are self-control. That's what a boundary is. Boundaries do not control other people. Boundaries are self-control. Boundaries, your boundary is for you. My boundary is for me. Okay? I don't go around telling people what they can and cannot do. All right? I largely have not done that even when I was pastoring. And I know a lot of times churches can be controlling, pastors can be controlling. I basically told people, you need to, hear from the Holy Spirit, do what the Spirit of God's telling you. Okay. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't give some management and some direction. I'm not talking about that. Okay. But boundaries are self-control. Now, we're in the kingdom of God, you guys. Watch this. So our mindset needs to be a mindset based on what the kingdom of heaven says to us. The world has its own way of doing it. And again, going back to Dixie's earlier comment, right, spot on, because the world, the system of the world, the God of this world has it set up to where, people control other people. That's the world. The world is about controlling others, right? Again, sometimes people say, well, look at how greedy and how much money they have. It's not about the money, okay? The money is just a tool. It's about the ability to control. That's the world system. But in the kingdom of heaven, it's not about controlling others. In the kingdom of God, it's all about self-control. You control self. Within the word of God, we see in Galatians that the fruit of the Spirit is being able to have self-control. That's within us. So our focus needs to be on us and on our boundaries, showing or not only outside world, but ourselves, that we value self in so much that we have put a fence around our life to protect our border, our boundary line. You got it? So But again, you see this all throughout the Bible where it talks about boundaries. In 2 Corinthians, make note of this scripture as well. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse number 14, the Bible says, what fellowship has light with darkness? That's a type of boundary. God's the one that's created boundaries. God has boundaries. All right. And we can talk more about that. But here you see, so what fellowship does light have with darkness? It doesn't is the answer. So that's a type of boundary. So when darkness, are you of the light? Are you the children of the light? The answer is yes. I am. Light dwells in me, therefore I am light. So when darkness comes, the boundary says, no, there's no fellowship that I have with it. Now, I'm not talking about ministering to people or, preaching to people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when you're engaging with people who have toxic behavior, okay, dark thinking, negative, you could say negative thinking, whatever it is, and you engage with that, you have no limits. And that spirit, that controlling spirit, Jezebel, okay, or narcissism, that will come in and it will look to invade your life. So it's very important that you understand that you need to have boundaries. Now, if you have no boundaries, so let's just say you say to yourself, well, I don't really like this. I don't really care. I just think that I should, whatever they say, yeah, I should just do it and so on. Well, let's go over let me show you this scripture. All right. Proverbs chapter 25, verse number 28. And I'm going to read it again in the English Standard Version. So Proverbs 25 and 28. And it says this, a man without self-control, and I just said that you can look at boundaries as self-control. A man without self-control or a man without boundaries for his own life is like a city broken into and left without walls. So if you choose to say, well, boundaries aren't really important to me, you're most likely going to be controlled somehow, okay, or by someone or something, and you're going to live a life that there's no self-control. Therefore, your life is going to resemble a city that is left without walls. It's where the enemy comes in and just breaks things up in your life. Okay, so indeed, boundaries are important. Indeed, we need to have boundaries. All right. Doesn't the Bible say that we're in the world but not of it? That's a type of boundary. We're in the world, but we're not of it. There we go. Now we have God talking more about boundaries. You could go to the beginning, the law of original intent, okay, where you see God who's setting everything up, and then he says, look, I'm going to have, here's a boundary. Here's the first boundary given by God. What was that? Well, what it was you can eat of everything, but here comes the boundary. That tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat of. Now, did God control Adam and Eve or humanity from participating and eating of that tree? Do you see God saying, with some type of, where he zaps them if they even get close to it? No, he just said, look, here's the boundary. I'm communicating a boundary, and you can have everything that you like. However, that right there, no. Well, we know how that ended up. Eve and Adam, they participate and they say, no, we're going to go ahead and blow through that boundary. And what was the outcome of that, you guys? Well, the outcome was now a consequence. And God states upright, he says, look, in the day that you decide to eat that, you shall truly die. So God says, look, I set this before you, and I'm saying, don't. That's the boundary I'm given. But should you choose, because we have freedom of choice, okay? God is, always remember this, God is pro-choice. Now, people have problems with that, especially evangelicals, where they start thinking like, oh my goodness, abortion and all that stuff. I'm not talking about abortion. God has given humanity the right of choice. God is pro-choice. But God is also pro-life. So he says, yes, you can make any decision you want, but choose life. Now, if we don't choose life, then again, there's ramifications or there's consequences for our choices. All right. And yes, Lewis, you're 100% right. I was thinking about that yesterday. The garden in and of itself was a boundary. Even after the fall, God said, okay, you know what? Let's set up, angels here. You will no longer come in. I'll give you another one. Okay. And again, we're just hitting the top of the surface here. God says in Revelation 22:15 that outside the city, all right, you can jot that one down, Revelation 22:15, that outside the city, now the city is representing the kingdom of heaven, that outside the kingdom are the dogs, sorcerers, and the sexually immoral, and those that live a lie. It's another boundary. Not everybody gets into the kingdom. It's a boundary. So the Bible's full of boundaries. I could take you down that path and talk about, biblical boundaries and examples and stuff like that. But again, you need to understand that boundaries are important. And if you do not have boundaries, you are living a life of no limits. And therefore, you have opened yourself up. You've made yourself susceptible to people coming in and invading your life. Boundaries are to establish boundaries is your God-given right, but also your God-given responsibility. God requires you, okay? This may trigger someone, but God requires you to have boundaries, okay? Because again, it's that fence, it's that property line. You need to let people know where they should stop. You need to let people know. I mean, why? Again, I always think about this, about doors. We have a door because we're basically saying you can't come in here. And if somebody just somebody busts through your door, comes in and kicks down your door, what are you going to do? You're just going to sit there and say, oh, well, have some tea. Here, sit down. Let's have some, meander around the house, do whatever you want. Take advantage of people. Do this, that, and the other. No, there has to be consequences to somebody just breaking down your door. If not, they'll just come in and again, you become a city that's just ramshackled and without walls. So it's your responsibility to set boundaries for your life. I want to say this. You're not setting up boundaries for other people. You're not saying, well, you can't. No. A boundary is not you can't, because they can do whatever they want. They can decide to barge right through your door. They have that. They can do that. They can hop the fence. They can do so. Don't say when you create boundaries, and we'll talk about how to do that. That you say, well, you're not going to. No. Your boundary doesn't stop them from doing it. A boundary is just you communicating and saying, look, these are the rules. This is where I stop and you start, or you stop and I start. This is my sphere. This is my boundary. So again, it's your responsibility to set those boundaries for your life, not set boundaries for other people. Healthy people, delivered people who are not suffering through emotional, pain, wounds, trauma, and all that stuff, never place demands on other people, specifically in the area of controlling other people. Okay. They know that their boundaries are designed to protect one's own personal space. Now, again, when establishing boundaries, you must express or you must communicate those boundaries. A boundary not expressed or communicated is not a boundary at all. So you can't say, well, I have boundaries, but nobody knows about them. Okay? You have to communicate boundaries. And sometimes you communicate them after the fact and say, whoa, let me, if you met some stranger or, whatever, and they start cussing all in your face and all this other stuff, they didn't know that your boundary was. I had this happen when I was in the workforce in corporate America, as it were. They would always cuss in the office and all this other stuff. And I'd say, look, I don't participate in that. Or they'd go out and drink and they'd say, hey, you want to, and they'd pour me a drink. I'd be like, no. Because why? Because I'm saying, here's my boundary. I don't do that. You can do it all you want. You can cuss all you want. You can, but when you get within my presence, I'm going to deploy a consequence to you consistently cussing. And that means I'll leave the meeting or I'll leave the room or whatever. Now, the longer I did that, the more they knew that, hey, Robert doesn't like when we stand around and cuss people out or have some off-color joke, whatever it may be. You have to let people know. All right. Now, don't get angry about it right off the bat, because you can't get angry about things towards people when they didn't even know you had a boundary. So if somebody comes with some off-color joke, all right, that you didn't like, just let them know that. And then going forward, then you can have consequences if they continue that. But if they said something off color, don't just blow gasket and, oh my goodness, and get all these movements that are out there about, now you need to go to prison, or, you need to be penalized for doing it. They didn't know, because that's what they've been doing. They've normalized what they've been doing. But let them, once it's done, you have to say, okay, here's, granted, I understand what you did, but let me express my boundaries to you. Okay. Now, what are some of the type of boundaries we have? Well, we have boundaries in virtually all areas of life. Physical boundaries. We should have emotional boundaries. We should have sexual boundaries, material or resource boundaries. In other words, I'm sorry, you're just not going to be able to just take my car anytime you want, right? I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to drive my car and just, choke out all the gas because you wanted to drive around and do all this other stuff. No, the boundary is, you drive the car, you put the gas in there. And if you don't put the gas in there, you don't drive the car again. Now we think that, we can't do that to people. These poor people out there. You need to get delivered from that mindset. If your mindset is, the poor people of the world, the poor people here, there, I'm not talking about we shouldn't help people, but it has to be done the right way. All right. And people are always triggering every time something's going on in the world. It's like, oh my God, just deal with you. Let's get you okay. All right. And stop triggering about all the other stuff and create healthy boundaries. So when you create these boundaries, let me pause here for a moment. Okay. I want to look at this. Controllers will try to get you to cross your own boundaries. Oh yeah, without question. Yeah, they're manipulative in that area. It's almost like making a contract or a bid for contracting services. They know, and what to expect in the scope of the work. The contract makes it clear, but both parties, if they request more work to be done outside the contract, then they've crossed the boundary, if you will, and now the job got bigger, costing more money. Yes, very true. So you have to stop and say, okay, I got it, but you're going outside, again, the scope, or you're breaking the boundary of the contract. Now we need to address that. We need to either rewrite it or create another contract with different boundaries. But again, I think boundaries are great. I think boundaries will keep a lot of people out of trouble, as it were, specifically with connecting with, toxic relationships or Jezebelic type relationships, controlling relationships. And, maybe you're sitting there and saying, well, too late now, I'm already in one. Well, what a great time to say, you know what, I could change here. I have the right to say no more. So it used to be this way. Yeah, you used to call me this word, or you used to treat me this way, or whatever. Okay. But now I have understanding. I've been equipped. I've been educated on boundaries. And therefore, here's my boundary. And your boundary could be something like, I can, or my boundary is, here's a good one. My boundary is I will not allow myself to be, or my decisions to be criticized to the point that it's beating you down. All right. I don't allow that. And if it's done, then what's the consequence? Well, you have to look at that. Do I leave the room? Do I go and take a break, take a time out, go, take a walk around the block, come back? Do I exit the relationship? I mean, that's why we coach people to kind of go specifically and say, okay, let's look at this, and literally in some cases take several sessions to create healthy boundaries so that those boundaries can be deployed. I want to share this with you guys. When we talk to people about boundaries, especially if they're in a relationship right now with a controlling person, they have a real hard time with it. They're terrified. There's so much fear. They're so yoked up that they're like, I just can't see myself doing that. That's essentially the person saying, I just can't see my life because I've morphed into, or I've complied with all this toxic behavior. So how can I tell my husband that what I've done for years, okay? I've heard some real interesting stories, but what I've done or permitted for years, that I can now come back and say, you know what, no more. Here's my boundary. I am not going to allow myself to do that any longer. Why? Because I have self-respect. Terrified to say that. Well, what's going to happen to my husband? He may leave me. Well, if you're married to someone who, because you value you, and you say, you know what, I'm not going to, let's just say, the husband is calling you out of your name, constantly yelling at you and all this other stuff. And you just say, look, I'm just not going to tolerate that any longer. My boundary is that if or when I'm being yelled at or spoken to in a condescending way, that I'm going to leave the room. If you feel that you can't do that, you need some severe deliverance, okay? Because there's fear there's phobia, there's codependency issues that exist, and so on. So again, and you may fear retaliation. Maybe you fear from the controller that the controller is going to retaliate against your boundaries. And many times they would do that. A controlling person would say, okay, well, you have a boundary. Well, here's my boundary. And they'll go tit for tat with you, and they'll say, hey, here's my boundary. Well, that's fine. If that's their boundary, you can respect their boundary. But usually a controller doesn't have boundaries for their life. They're trying to create boundaries for your life. All right. And you're just not, your boundary is going to say, no, that's not, I don't inherit or take other people's boundaries from my life. That's your space. So if you want to have a boundary for you, that's fine. But you're not going to threaten to me. You're not going to threaten me or control me to where I have to fall in line with your boundaries. Okay. My life. Now, again, boundaries, I want to drive that point home. Boundaries are for you. They're not for other people. But once they're created, and I'll give you guys a few. Matter of fact, let me do that now. Let me give you some of the boundaries that I actually have. So again, I told you there's boundaries for emotions. There's a boundary, sexual boundaries, financial boundaries, all this other stuff. But one of the boundaries, or one of the things that I say for me, again, the boundaries for me, I'm not telling other people what to do, that I can, or I will, my boundary is I will turn off my phone to the world, okay, at large, notwithstanding maybe a couple family members or whatever, at a specific time or on demand. Listen, my wife, she's on, she knows. If I get a call and I do not want to talk to that person, I just click the, do not disturb, or, reject the call. Now, somebody may be saying, well, wait, you need to be available to us. Well, I could be available to you, but on my terms, not your terms. You don't have the right. My daughter and I talked about this. These phones, bless them, I'm glad I have one. But the fact that we have one does not mean that you have a right to my life. Have you ever, watch this now, have you ever had someone text you and you didn't answer? You just said, well, I'll get to it later, whatever, you're busy at work or what have you. And maybe it was a day or two, or maybe you forgot. But at the end of the day, you didn't get to it right away. And they start texting you, or they call and say, hey, you get my text? Well, yeah, I got it 5 minutes ago. Well, you haven't responded. I don't need to, I'm not going to be controlled. And my boundary says that I do not have, my boundary is this. This is my specific boundary. Robert can take his time returning calls, emails, or texts. That's for me. Not pushing that on anybody else. All right. Robert can disregard specifically and delete calls or emails that are not important to me. That's a boundary for Robert. I'll give you another one Robert has. Robert can change his mind. Now, that's his big one because a lot of people don't want you to change your mind. This is why I always tell people, you better be careful when somebody asks you to do something or for something. But Robert can change his mind. I have a right, my boundary for me is I have a right to change my mind. And therefore, if you come and try to, bum rush my life because I've changed my mind due to circumstances and or information that I didn't have at the time, I have a right to do that. Okay? I have a right to cancel appointments at will. Specifically, like if I'm not feeling well or maybe I'm tired or whatever. How many people have done things that you don't want to do? Just ask yourself that question. How many times have you engaged in things, worked with people, gone somewhere for people, given people things, and you didn't want to? The reason you did it is because you don't have any boundaries for your life. Okay? I'll give you another one. I have a boundary as it pertains to people. My boundary is I do not allow myself to be the target of someone else's anger. Now, they can be angry all they want, but they're not going to project that on me. Okay? So how do I communicate that? Well, I communicate that by saying, look, I will not permit myself to be yelled at. If you continue, I will have to leave the room. That's me communicating a boundary. Now, I'm not here to say that every person I know I've communicated all this stuff to. I haven't. But as relationships, progress or wherever they go, I have a responsibility to do that because I can't hold myself accountable or somebody else accountable for things I have not communicated. Okay. Money's another one. Okay. Somebody says, hey, can I have X, Y, and Z money, whatever? Can you loan me money? My boundary is, and this is how I express it, I'm sorry, I do not loan anyone money. Or I have things that I say like, I'm sorry, I do not have any funds available for this purpose. So again, we could go deep into this thing. And I think, again, if you're struggling in this area, coaching would be really good for you. But we want to make certain that we have these boundaries, we communicate those boundaries, because if you don't communicate boundaries, you're basically saying, I have no limits. And that could be very dangerous, you guys, especially in relationships. If you have no boundaries in a relationship, you're basically sending a signal to other people that I don't know how to take care of myself. And that's why I said, unfortunately, God bless our families of origin, but they did not, when they could not give what they did not have, therefore they did not, tell us about boundaries, which later on is going to affect us because we're going to signal to others that we don't know how to take care of ourselves. As a matter of fact, and I may have said this once before on our time of equipment or our broadcast, is that we actually have our culture a little bit, well, not a little bit messed up, but quite a bit messed up, because notice what we do with children. Okay, this is really good with children. Now, I have grandkids. And let's say I have a grandchild, and my grandchild's name is Johnny. And little Johnny's about 2 years old, and he has a bunch of gifts. He has fire engines, he has cars, he has trucks and toys and all this other stuff. And Johnny's over there playing with his truck and all this other stuff. And somebody comes into my house, and we invite them in, say, hey, how you doing? It's another couple. And they have a little son and also 2 years old or thereabout. They come in and say, oh, go put your son over there to play with my son, Johnny. So they go over in this area and they start playing with toys, and little Johnny has his truck. And the child, you've seen this before, the visiting child takes the truck and starts playing with it. and Johnny takes the truck back and actually snatches the truck from the child and wants to play. And they start crying and all this other stuff. And then the parents rush in, and the parents, and again, if it was me, say to little Johnny, why don't you let Billy play with the truck? Now you need to give Billy that truck. And then little Johnny, puts his head down and gives Billy the truck. Billy's over there playing, and we call that, because you need to share. You need to share, and well, what do we say in there? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't play right and so on, but what we're doing is we're embedding into that child's subconscious specifically that when someone takes something of mine that I don't want them to have or take, that I don't have any recourse here. I pretty much should just let Billy have the truck. And that starts early on in life. And again, you may look at that as a small thing. I don't. I see that our behaviors as humans, specifically from our family of origin, has been tremendously messed up. And now we go through life. And then, what happens when you're a teenager? What happens when the teenager is connecting with the opposite sex? Let's say it's a girl, and now some boy comes in and he wants to, he's 14 years old or younger, and now begins to touch and fondle. Where's the boundary here? Where's the boundary? You read all throughout. I mean, there's so many scandals going on today. I can't think of them all. But you have people that it's coming out that they've touched, they fondled, they abused, they sexually manipulated, and all this other stuff. Well, where were your boundaries? Where were the boundaries? Now, I'm not faulting these people for not having boundaries. I get it. But my point is that we need to have boundaries, and right at the bat say, nope, no. It's not that's not going to happen, because again, this is my boundary. All right. I'm not going to permit people to do that. Okay. So again, and if you do it, there's a consequence. There's always a consequence for a violation to a boundary. I was thinking about this when I was a kid. Watch this now. This is I like this example. So a boundary with, it's violated. So somebody does something, they cuss you out, they touch you, they, come in your house, or, whatever the boundary was, what was violated. Think in terms of that boundary being a fence and a chain link fence. I remember growing up in Chicago, we lived near the Chicago River, and they had boat yards, and this is back in those days, you could actually do this stuff as a kid, and it was wrong, but you didn't hear it on the news. And we would goof around, and we would go in and look to hop the fence at boat yards and goof around. We didn't even take anything because there was really nothing to take. Okay. At least from our perspective, but we would do things, and we would play, and we'd hop fences. Well, in this boat yard, I'll never forget this. One of the guys I was with, and again, I'm like 12 years old, all right? And so they're hopping these fences, but the fence had barbed wire. And as they went to climb the fence, again, the fence is the boundary, they got up there, and as they were trying to put their leg over it, the barbed wire, and if you know anything about barbed wire, it's extremely sharp. It's like razor blades up there. And they got cut. I mean, they just got cut. They're bleeding all over the place and running home and all that other stuff. Well, that's what think of the terms of that fence says, hey, and there was a big sign that says no trespassing. You can stay out there. You can look into the boat yard, but you can't go in here and meander around and all this other stuff. Well, we're goofing around, but it doesn't matter. We decided, in this case, this guy decides to go over the fence, and he gets cut real bad, bleeding all over the place. So that is a type of consequence to the violation of breaking through a border. All right. The barbed wire did not cut that guy. That guy cut himself. The barbed wire was fine. It was sitting there. It wouldn't hurt anyone. It would do absolutely nothing. It didn't project itself. Once we got to 3 feet to the wall, didn't do any of that stuff. It's like an electric fence. And that electric fence, you can stand right next to it. As long as you don't touch it, you're fine. Well, the barbed wire is the same way. As long as you don't try to violate the boundary that exists, you're fine. But the moment you do, then you're going to cut yourself. The same holds true for people that violate personal boundaries. Whatever the consequence is, okay, it's not you that's doing anything to them. They did it to themselves. Okay. So, again, we need to make certain that we make healthy choices, all right, for our lives. How? By establishing firm boundaries and deploying consequences that violate boundaries. Listen, consequences. So again, I'll go deep into this, and I see you, Dick. So I'm going to just say this, and then I'll give it to you. Consequences, like let's say it was something. And it's like, no, I have a boundary here. I'm severing the relationship between you and I, or I'm putting distance in the relationship between you and I. A lot of people have problems with that. Okay, and they say, well, you just need to love them. You just need to pray for them more. All right. Listen, consequences and boundaries is not a lack of love towards other people. On the contrary, it's actually an expression of love towards our creator God, our neighbor, and ourselves. So don't get caught up in this lie that somehow, it's not right to have consequences to boundaries. Go ahead, sweetheart. I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't see your hand earlier.
Okay, I was just gonna give an example of what you said. The fence was excellent, but I'm gonna give an example of a dog. Okay,
Good.
and I went to visit one of my friends, and this was I must have been back at 18, 19. I was maybe about 18, 19 years old, so I was still a teenager, and I went to go visit a friend of mine, and I was talking, I was talking to him, and I hit him, like, I was thinking like I'm talking. I'm like, yeah, that's right. And I hit him, and he had a dog there. And when I hit him, the dog launched at me, and I froze. I mean, I was just like, I froze. I started crying. I was like, and so he was like, well, when the dog launched, she immediately said sit, and the dog sat. And then I was like, that's a bad dog. That dog just hit me. I wasn't trying to, that dog tried to attack me, and I wasn't doing nothing. He said, no, this isn't a bad dog. He said, the dog was only responding to what? A boundary that I had taught that dog, that no one is going to hit me or do anything to harm me. So I was like, I really couldn't understand it. And until he explained to me, he said, a bad dog will be a dog that just jumps at you for no reason to bite you. He said that dog should be put down. But a dog that is protecting, okay, and I'm thinking this is a boundary. Is not, the dog isn't bad. The dog's only doing what it's been taught to do because you crossed a boundary. Now, you weren't hitting me to hurt me or anything, but that dog doesn't know that. The dog's only doing what it was taught to do. So I thought this was a good thing when it came to me when you said about the fence. Well, the fence can't move. The fence can't, it can't do it, protect you in that way. But a animal can be taught to do that. So that's why you'll see people that have put dogs on their property, and that dog is like to protect that boundary.
Yeah.
So that, and he explained it so good to me. He said, a dog that's been taught correctly will not touch you until you walk on the property of their owner, or you touch the owner, which is that what they've been taught to protect. So you can walk all down the street. A dog that's taught properly will not even bark, until you cross that property line, you cross that fence, then you'll be aware that dog is there. He said, that's a dog that's taught boundaries. Right. But a dog that just jumps and starts running after you, and you're walking on the other side, across the street, or walking down the sidewalk, that dog, he said, for me, I think that dog should be put down, and it was, wow. It just are trained. He said, need to be either trained or put down. If it's been trained and it doesn't do what it's told, then it's put down. I thought it was really good. Now that I'm thinking back at that, we have to kind of see that as far as where boundaries are concerned.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're
Consequences
right.
for,
And while you're,
for
oh,
consequences
I'm sorry.
for what? Oh, I was just going to say breaking a boundary.
Right.
Okay. That's all.
No, no, you're right. And I was just thinking actually while you were talking is that, creation, God's creation at large will express boundaries. For example, if you go to touch we have out here cacti, a lot of cacti. And if you go and touch it, and you get poked, yeah, the boundary, I mean, the thorn suggests, no, I don't want to be touched. Now, you can't get angry and cut down the cactus plant because you got poked. Or, I go back to the dog. I love animals, but I know with dogs, some dogs that once they're eating, they're being fed, and you go up to them and start touching or touch their bowl and all that stuff. They start out with this, a growl. They'll give you, they'll show you, they'll give you a little growl. What they're letting you know, I mean, they don't speak English, right? Or whatever language. They're letting you know that, hey, that's a boundary. This is my stuff here. And that's what we need to do. We need to create boundaries, write them down. Okay. Like I said, I can look online here and I have pages for me of boundaries. And I have to remind myself, hey, Robert, this is your boundary. But then express those boundaries to people. Okay. And then have the consequences, and you have a right to